Hello, and welcome back to the Gyrolab Spin. This is our second episode. My name is Rob Durham,
And I'm John Chappell.
and today we're going to talk a bit about the viewer.
So the viewer profile interpretation, this is for me is a really important discussion. It's really something that's a unique part of the Gyrolab and its software, and it gives you a lot of information. So we gave this presentation initially at the user meeting in Dublin, and followed up with the US meeting in New Jersey. And this presentation was put together by our colleagues Eric Feely and Linda Klaus. And we found it from a user perspective was very useful. So we thought that we'd record this, and because we think it really gives really valuable information.
So the agenda for today's presentation is to give some background information on the viewer, how it's used, and how it can be used to facilitate understanding photomultiplier tube settings.
Also, we want to show you how the viewer really can be used for troubleshooting and also assay optimization, and shows things like spikes, aggregates, block columns, or also other assay problems which could be for used very much for diagnostic purposes.
And then we'll end with some discussion about the newer high capacity column CDs, when to use those, and John's got a really great example for an assay for rat EPO, which where the high capacity column really came in handy. So with the viewer, you can access this directly from within the evaluator module. You can simply right-click on one of your data points or in the data table, and it will allow you to pop up a window which showcases the actual image of the binding profile on your column. This makes it very easy to access, and it really facilitates assay development, where you can really visualize that binding affinity and identify optimal binding partners, and it allows you to really investigate outliers and troubleshoot during assay development or routine analysis. And John, I think for me, this is one of the key differentiators between the Gyrolab platform and almost any other ligand binding platform out there.
Yeah, no, it's such a unique tool, and it's so useful as well. And it's available to all users that use our software, and it just gives so much information. And we just want to encourage our users to use this functionality because it really can help.
Yeah, I think initially for new users that aren't used to using the Gyros system, it can be a bit intimidating to think about what you're really looking at. So hopefully today's presentation will give you a way to get started using the viewer. So when we're thinking about using the Gyrolab Viewer, I want to just show this sort of an ideal peak here. You can see this image on the right. We have a peak profile which shows the retained fluorescence on the column. And if you think about how the column is organized, if we go in the x-axis from left to right, this is the direction of liquid flow, is shown by the arrow across the column. So the top of the column is in the center of the CD, and the outer edge of the CD is the bottom of the column. Along the z-axis here is around the angle of the column. So this axis is usually labeled angle in this three-dimensional rendering, and that's across the top of the column. And then of course the y-axis represents the fluorescence intensity. You can see we've actually colorized the image a bit so that red is high intensity fluorescence and blue is low intensity fluorescence. The other thing that you can kind of see here is there's an integration box which defines the area of the column that we're actually going to count. Outside that integration box, we don't count anything, and this is done to facilitate a consistent signal owing to some small differences in column height that you can see in the manufacturing process, and then the possibility that down here in the outflow in the bottom of the column you can sometimes see aggregates which can interfere with the signal that are non-specific. And so it's important that you understand what a normal column profile looks like, and then we'll go into some detail through the presentation today to discuss what abnormal profiles look like.
So what we do see here is an ideal binding profile. So we have a sharp peak with narrow radial distribution, which indicates a high affinity interaction. If you have lower affinity interactions, you will get a bigger spread of the binding across the column. So this is quite important, and it gives you a lot of information. So also we can see no signal spikes visible within the binding profile. So this is showing good binding. And also it's important to see that the signal is not saturated. And you can see we've got a nice formation of the peak in the profile.
One of the first things that you can really do with the viewer is to determine whether you've saturated the detector or not. And you can see in the images on the left, 1, 5, and 25% PMT or photomultiplier tube setting. This is the gain setting on the detector. You can see that at 25% and at 5%, we're seeing a big plateau where you don't see a peak on the thing, on the viewer profile at all. It's very flat at the top, indicating that we've really saturated the detector. You can see in the curves that we've hit this sort of plateau in the curve as well, and so we're not seeing any different signal because we've maxed out the detector. So if we decrease the PMT setting from 25 to 5 and then 1%, we can see that at the 1% here, we don't have saturation of the detector, and that will give us a good binding profile. Now compare that to the example on the right where we have two peak profiles which are neither are saturated, but we're seeing a plateau in the curve. And this would suggest then that we haven't saturated the detector, but maybe what we've done is saturated the column chemistry itself. And so at some point you have maxed out the column, the binding capacity of whatever your capture reagent is, and you don't see any greater signal when you push a higher concentration of analyte over the column.
Now we move on to troubleshooting and the use of the viewer profiles to try and diagnose issues when you observe them in your assays. Here we look at some quality control data, and we can investigate some outliers using the viewer profile. Here we can actually see a stop indicated in the Gyrolab evaluator, and the viewer profile shows this where all the fluorescent is at the start of the column. This is caused by particulate matter in any of the liquids flowing through the capture column.
So, you know, I've seen this a number of times, and one of the key examples that I remember was we had some plasma samples that were rather lipemic. And in a lipemic plasma sample, of course, you have a lot of lipid material in there, and when you spin down the plasma sample, you get three layers. You get a lipid layer on top, the plasma layer in the middle, and then any aggregated or clotted material will go to the bottom. So when the analyst was going through that lipid layer, they would pick up a little chunk of lipid, and then that was causing about 20% of the microstructures to become plugged, and we'd see examples of these stops like this. And as you pointed out, John, the nice thing is that this will indicate that you've got a stop when it can't accurately find the top of the column. The fluorescence signal is too high above the column, and then that image analysis software isn't able to find the top of the column, and so it indicates a stop in the report. So blocked columns really have a distinct signature, and so let's look at a couple of pairs of examples here. So you can see on the left, you get this sort of elevated baseline at the top of the column. If you're looking at the x-axis from left to right, the top of the column is to the left. And you can see on that first image, there's a little bit of an elevated baseline, suggesting that there's some restricted flow through that column. Whereas in the right image, you can see that looks normal. Here's another example on the same plate where again we had this elevated baseline at the front, indicating some sort of restricted flow. You're seeing some things flow over the column, but obviously there's some sort of restriction that is causing us to have increased fluorescence at the top of the column. And just so you know that it's not always the first one, here's an example where it's the second one. Again, showing that one replicate looks good, the other replicate of the two replicates that were run for each of these samples shows that appearance of a block column. Of course, this will cause very different results in terms of the response that we're seeing.
Yeah. And the root cause of this problem was actually investigated, and we found what the issue was. So in this case, the assay was being run with 100% matrix, and the samples were being dispensed in the microtiter plate, and then the microtiter plate was being spun with 100% matrix. So all the particulate debris was being pelleted to the bottom of the microtiter plate, and of course the needle, when it dispenses the sample from the plate to the CD, it will then go into the particulate matter, and this is the root cause of this issue that's been identified in this slide.
Yeah, and when we quit spinning the plates, the problem resolved itself, and so it's a good example of how the viewer really facilitated the troubleshooting and identifying the root cause of the problem.
Yeah, and in this case, the samples were effectively mixed and spun before being dispensed to the microtiter plate.
Yeah. So here's one additional example that shows block columns between two pairs of replicates, and you can see you can get quite dramatic differences in the response value. On the left, you see the response value is 64.1 versus a response value in the normal looking peak of about 0.98 response units. And so this can lead to very dramatic CV differences that will appear in your report as well, and probably lead you to investigate the viewer profiles to understand what's going on.
So also the block columns are flagged by the Gyrolab Evaluator automatically. If you look under the detect result column, if this gives an indication whether there's a block column or not, and in this case you can see where it says not okay, and then when we look at the viewer profile we can see that this confirms their block column. So this gives us an indication that you don't necessarily have to use the viewer, but obviously the viewer profile is given additional information and really shows the blockage of the columns.
So one of the more common outliers that you see in some of these viewer profiles is the presence of non-specific fluorescence. So you can see in these two examples is a sharp peak that doesn't look like it's evenly distributed across the whole column, or you get these sort of cliffs or very strange looking structures on there that don't look like the more ideal specific binding peaks that we were showing earlier.
I mean, fluorescence spikes can really impact assay performance. So how should we deal with this, Rob?
Yeah, so I think, initially you're going to see that you want to understand what's causing the problem. And I would say the majority of the time it's something to do with the detect reagent. Whenever I see these kind of images, especially in the blank, this is an indication that's probably aggregation in your detect reagent. One of the common things that we recommend folks do is to use the Rexip F to dilute your fluorescent tagged detection reagent because it contains a little extra detergent. Yeah. In this case, you can see again, where the fluorescence spike in the left gives us a response of 2 versus a 0.2 response in the control or in the comparator replicate that doesn't have the spike. Again, one of the keys here is that we've normalized the intensity, the y-axis, so that you're looking at the same intensity level across both. Normally, this viewer profile will auto scale those, and so you want to be careful that you're looking at the right intensity, but this sort of highlights when you see this sort of dramatic difference between the response levels.
This is a perfect example where auto scaling can actually confuse the interpretation. So this is a great example where a spike in one of the profiles makes it look very, very different to the other profile. But if you actually look at on the same scale, you start to see that actually the specific response is actually very similar, and the spike is actually causing a misinterpretation of the data. And this is kind of highlighted, as you
Yeah, I think here, you're right, John. I think this is highlighted here. If we take a look at side by side, we've taken away the colorized image and made sure that they're set at the same scale. And so now when you see the one replicate without a spike and the replicate with a spike, if we overlay those two, you can begin to see that probably that specific binding pattern on the column is right there hiding underneath that spike.
Yeah, that's a very good example.
Another way to look at this same image, again, you're seeing here where we've auto scaled it to 0.4, you can see that the peak on the left really goes off scale. Another way to do this is utilize the 2D intensity plot, because that doesn't do the auto scaling trick and it keeps everything on normalized to one another. So if we look at 2D plot, it's a little hard to see here, but you can see that big spike in the first replicate, and then there's a normal peak here, which looks very similar across the two replicates, suggesting that the specific binding is there hiding underneath that spike.
So the issues that we've highlighted in the viewer profiles, there are ways that we can mitigate and avoid some of these issues. So really, if you centrifuge the detection reagent, this will hopefully resolve a lot of these issues.
Yeah, typically you do 4 minutes at, around 12,000 G, is sufficient to, in your stock detection reagent material. And then you just want to be sure that you can actually visualize where the material is in the tube, and then be able to pull an aliquot out off the top of the stock material. I've had some people that will dutifully spin down the detect, and they've put a tiny aliquot of maybe 30 microliters in a brown or black tube, and when they spin it down, you can't obviously visualize the sample in the tube, and so it makes it very difficult then for someone to get away from the aggregated material, and may actually exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, so I mean, you need to use the appropriate tubes and the appropriate aliquots when you're doing your sample prep and your reagent prep.
Yeah. And the same goes for the samples too. The next most common problem that will cause both blocked samples and also non-specific binding on the column is some particulate in the matrix that will bind your detect reagent in a non-specific way.
Yeah. We do find a lot of people wanting not to centrifuge samples, which I find a bit strange actually. As someone who did bioanalytical work for over 20 years, I mean, spinning the samples is fundamental, irrespective of the immunoassay technique. Because when you thaw a sample, you get precipitation of proteins, so you do need to mix and spin. And that's good basic laboratory technique for me, but people seem to want to avoid it.
Yeah, and I think another possibility. I had a number of methods where we would do solid phase extraction is another possibility. If you wanted to do 96 samples at a time, you could do a 96 or a solid phase extraction plate is another possibility. Again, it really depends on the type of assay that you're running. I know that there are some assays where you really don't want to disturb the equilibrium of what's going on in the sample, and you have to be careful about that. So next on the list then is probably making sure your wash buffers and your diluents are handled appropriately. We always talk about if you've made something up from a powdered stock like the pH 11 wash buffer, or your PBS buffers, you want to be sure and filter those before using them. Make sure that you're not getting into aggregated material in those buffers as well.
Yeah, and it's very important that you use fresh solutions and aliquot your reagents, because that's very key, and also that prevents contamination, but it's just good laboratory practice.
Yeah, and I think one of the keys that I've found in my own work on the system was that you could use a detection reagent for a while, store it in the fridge, and just repeatedly use it. I worked in discovery, so I had a little bit more leeway to not be so particular, but then I would find that over time that aliquot would go off, and then I'd need to pull a new one out of the freezer. And so having some strategy where you can, improve the reproducibility and robustness of the assay and mitigate the potential for handling errors is really key.
Yeah, I think as was mentioned during our user meeting, also you can put too little volume into aliquots as well.
Yeah.
Particularly if it basically can start drying onto the side of the tube. You don't get affected spinning or mixing of the sample. So you have to be very careful how you actually handle reagents.
Yeah. So in this next example, you can see where we have a relatively high background in a ready-to-use kit. So if you look at the red curve, we have a very high background, up to 100 response units in one curve, one reference curve, and in the other standard curve, you can see it's a more normal distribution. And if you look at the viewer profiles, the green curve, you can see these look like nice normal peaks. But what you notice in the bottom curve from the red example is a small trailing high background, which gets worse as we go along across those three images. And so we wanted to investigate what the root cause was for that high background in that particular one.
So we tried to identify root causes for these issues. I mean, this is a ready-to-use kit. We know the performance is pretty good for this kit. So the first potential cause is potential carryover. But in this case, it's unlikely this has been tested during the kit development, and it would probably not affect all standards in a similar extent.
And the next item on the list is contamination of the sample buffer with analyte. In such a case, the peaks would look like normal peaks. We saw that kind of weird trailing high background in the high background sample. So that doesn't really indicate that you just got sample where it shouldn't be. So it's unlikely that there's some sort of a contamination that explains that particular
and the
case.
Standard curve in this case was ready to use. It's less likely that you contaminate the buffers in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did find is there was the too little or no column wash buffer was actually loaded into the plate. So this actually caused the tail at the end of the peak. And this can actually be checked by looking at the residual volume in the microtiter plate. But as I think you were saying, Rob, we normally 100 microliters added. Yeah. You're expecting at least 20 microliters to be present at the end. If there's less than that, this can indicate that too little volume was loaded into the microtiter plate.
Right. Yeah. So when you look at when we add wash buffers to the plate by standard, they're all 100 microliters are added. You might use 2 or 3 or 4 in a single plate for all the wash steps in between each of the steps of the assay. And when it pulls that material out as it's doing those washes, the system knows how much was in the plate, and it will leave 20 microliters left in the plate. It'll only use 80, and then it'll move on to the next well. So this ensures that you don't run out of wash buffer in a plate unless you lied to the system and you didn't add what it told you to add, right? Never a good idea to lie to the instrument. It doesn't always.
The instrument knows.
The instrument knows.
Now we move over to an example of using the high capacity column for low affinity interactions. The high capacity column doesn't mean higher sensitivity, and then that's the important part, but they can be very useful for particular assays, and this gives a great example when they're very useful to be used. So when do we use the high capacity CD? So we're looking at the 1000 HC in this case, but the HC columns are packed with porous streptavidin coated beads, which has a higher binding capacity for capture reagents, and it can really improve assays that include low affinity reagents, such as a mixture of antibodies such as a polyclonal, for example. But it always should be tested alongside the equivalent CD. So for this example would be the 1000 CD, as it is very assay dependent. And so some assays will really benefit for the high capacity beads, but some others will not.
Yeah, I've run into this. So in general, the rule of thumb was always use your high affinity monoclonal antibody as the capture orientation so you can really take advantage of the affinity purification function of the column in the assay. But for these assays like the host cell protein assays, where you're really stuck with a polyclonal as your capture reagent, and you're binding a whole family of proteins onto the column, it can make it more challenging. And we've noticed that sort of broad radial spread that you see in the lower right hand is an example of the sort of what we talk about, a bread loaf.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you can see here that the one assay has got a very, very broad peak, whereas the high capacity is very narrow, the peak into a sharp peak. So this is something that can really improve your assay when you have a very wide peak profile that's seen in the viewer.
Yeah, and that results in an assay performance improvement too. So if you look in the table in the bottom there, you can see under the 1,000, we're twofold over background and 11% CV versus almost threefold over background and a much tighter CV for the HCCD in this case.
So we move on to a practical example of an assay that was developed in collaboration with a customer, and where the 1000 HC can really improve the assay. So this was for rat erythropoietin, which is a hormone secreted by the kidney, and it's used to increase red blood cell production in the body. It's been used in this case as a preclinical biomarker. And actually, this assay is now published and available in the Gyrolab assay section of the website. So when we actually developed the assay using the recombinant protein, we actually found that the bioaffy 1000 gave a better analytical range and assay performance. So it was natural to continue the assay using the 1000 CD rather than the HC CD. But when we actually then started looking at samples, we found an odd effect, and this highlighted a difference between the recombinant protein, which was the standard material, and the endogenous material. And in this case, the 1000 HC seemed to improve the viewer profile of the endogenous material. So there was a difference between the recombinant standard protein and the actual endogenous protein. And in this case, this seemed to be improved by using the higher binding capacity the column. And you can see here that when we actually look at the sample on the 1000 CD, the profile is very, very broad. But when we use the high capacity CD, it was very sharp and very similar to the recombinant protein.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In this case, you're using a monoclonal capture reagent, yeah. And still it's something to do with the way the cytokine binds to the capture reagent on the column, gives us this broad profile. And again, it doesn't happen always this way. I mean, sometimes we'll try the HC CD, and it'll actually make the background higher, will reduce the sensitivity of the assay, and it creates some problems in a otherwise good assay on the standard bioaffy. So it's worth taking a look at. I think if you have questions or you're seeing this broad radial spread, that's the key indicator for me that you need to give the HCCD a try.
But this is why it's important to look at the viewer profile and not just the response values, because this really gives you a lot of information of how things are binding on the column, and it can really highlight these issues. And so it's a very important tool for developing assays.
Right, it's a really compelling story. Thanks, John.
So in summary, the Gyrolab Viewer 1000 HCCD it can be a very useful tool. It doesn't always mean higher sensitivities, but when you have lower affinity interactions, it can be very useful. And you can use the viewer profile to really give an indication when the high capacity CD is actually needed for your assay.
Right. So in comparison to the sort of standard bioaffy CD, which you do want to do them side by side comparison, you may run into a situation like we did to the rat EPO assay, where you see those broad radial spread. The HCCD is going to improve that situation. There are times, however, when we've seen the HCCD actually increase the background, and that ends up reducing the sensitivity of the assay. So it's not a cure for every problem, but when you really see that signature viewer profile, and again, it highlights the usage of the viewer to really see how your analytes are binding to the column.
Yeah, I think the high capacity CDs are just a useful tool in the toolbox that you can use to develop your assay based on the performance and the reagents that you're using. So, I mean, I found the CD to be very useful, and it should, compare, contrast, and use the best CD for your assay.
So that brings us to the end of our half hour talking about the viewer. I hope this was really helpful for you. I think we've gotten really good feedback when we've made this presentation at the Gyrolab seminar, so hopefully this has been useful for you. Again, if you're interested in providing some feedback, suggesting new topics, please reach out to us. Our emails are here.
Thank you, everyone. Hopefully this has been very useful to you. We will have a follow-up podcast coming soon.
Great. Until next time.